Rancher found a hungry, young Bigfoot lost in the woods. What happened next? He'd seen every trail in this forest, every track, every shadow. But that night, the prints were different. Small, off balance, lost. Behind his barn, a shape hunched in the dark. Not a beast, not a child. Gray fur, eyes wide with hunger, not hate. He raised his rifle, then lowered it. The next day, he left a crust of bread. It returned the day after, with a handful of wild berries. Then came the storm. The small one didn't come. He found it under roots, trembling, hurt. Wrapped in his coat, he carried it home. No words, just breath and warmth. For days, they shared silence by the fire. No language, just trust, a kind that doesn't need names. One morning, it stood at the door, healed. A larger figure waited in the trees. It left without a sound. But on the porch, a stone, carved with a tiny hand. Before we begin, take a moment to comment the name of your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. The sun was sinking behind the western hills, turning the woods into long streaks of amber and blue. John Harland rode the fence line like he had every evening for 15 years, quiet, steady, alone. The air was cold enough to see his breath. The wind moved through the pines with a low, restless moan. Then he saw them, small footprints in the mud, not deer, not coyote, and not human. They were narrow, long, and scattered like something had been circling the ranch, curious but cautious. John crouched, tracing the edge of one print with his glove. The soil was still damp fresh. A soft sound came from behind the shed, a rustle, a breath. He stood slowly, hand resting on his rifle. Rounding the corner, he froze. There, beneath the weak light from the cabin window, was a small gray creature no taller than a child. Its fur hung wet and thin, its ribs visible beneath the coat. It was digging through the trash, clutching a dry bone to its chest like treasure. John lifted the rifle halfway, then stopped. The creature turned, wide-eyed, trembling, not wild, not dangerous, just lost. In those dark eyes, John saw something he hadn't felt in years: fear, hunger, and innocence. Something inside him softened. He lowered the gun, reached into his pocket, and placed a crust of bread on a flat stone. No words, just breath and silence. And as the creature stepped forward to take it, something quiet and human flickered back to life inside him. Part 1. The quiet days. The days that followed were colder. Winter had begun to roll down from the high ridges, brushing frost across the grass and leaving the mornings wrapped in a thin veil of white. John Harland woke before the sun as he always did. He lit the stove, poured black coffee into a tin cup, and stood by the window, watching the forest breathe steam into the valley. The footprints were still there, faint but visible, leading to the flat stone near the shed. That was where he'd left the crust of bread, and that was where, every evening since, he'd left something more: a slice of apple, a strip of dried meat, sometimes just a biscuit from the jar. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe pity, or maybe it was the first time in years he felt like someone or something might come back. The first few nights, nothing happened. But on the fourth, just as the last light slipped behind the hills, he saw movement between the trees. A small gray shape, careful and quiet, stepped from the brush. It paused at the edge of the clearing, sniffing the air. John stayed still inside the cabin, watching through the glass. The creature, the young Bigfoot, crept closer, each step slower than the last. It reached the stone, sniffed, and with trembling hands, took the food. Then, before retreating into the woods, it looked toward the cabin. Just one brief glance, cautious, but not afraid. John felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt since the night he lost his son. It was small and wordless, like the first crack of light after a long storm. The ritual continued. Every evening, he set the food out. Every evening, the creature came closer. Sometimes, he heard faint footsteps outside the barn at night. Other times, a shadow would pass near the window, quick, almost shy. He began to speak out loud again, though there was no one to answer. Not real conversation, just murmurs in the quiet. "Cold one tonight," he'd say as he filled the bucket with feed. Or, "Don't go near the fence line, Coyote's been out there." It felt strange, but right. The air didn't feel so empty when he spoke. One morning, after a long, windless night, John stepped outside and found something different. The food on the stone was untouched, but beside it lay a single red berry. It was small, bright against the frost, perfectly round and glistening with dew. He picked it up, rolling it between his fingers. It wasn't from any bush he knew of nearby. Someone or something had brought it. He looked toward the woods and saw a shape move between the trunks, the same small figure peeking out from behind a pine. It stood there for a moment, watching him. Then it made a soft, almost human sound, a breath, half sigh, half hum, before turning and slipping back into the trees. John stood frozen, the berry warm in his palm. He didn't chase, didn't call out. He just smiled, the first true smile he'd allowed himself in years. That night, he couldn't sleep. The wind outside the cabin carried a low hum, like the voice of the forest itself. He sat by the fire, the berry resting on the table beside his cup. He thought about the creature's eyes wide, dark, full of something that wasn't wildness, but recognition. He thought about his son, and the day he'd lost him to an accident in these same woods. And he wondered if maybe, just maybe, the world had sent him something back not as a punishment, but as a chance to remember what it meant to care for another living thing. He reached for his harmonica, an old, rusted one he hadn't played in years. When he blew the first note, it cracked and wavered like the sound of wind through pine needles. But the second note came easier, and the third, softer still, until the cabin filled with a slow, trembling melody, a song half prayer, half memory. Outside, the snow began to fall. Through the window, John thought he saw a faint silhouette near the tree line, a small figure, standing still, listening. He kept playing until the fire burned low, until the shadows stretched long and gentle across the floor. When he finally lay down, he dreamed of walking the same woods but hearing two sets of footsteps behind him, one heavy and human, one light and wild, following side by side through the frost. The next morning, the berry was gone. In its place was a small pine branch, laid across the stone like a token. John picked it up, smiled again, and whispered, "Thank you." Little one, for the first time in years. The ranch didn't feel empty. The fences still creaked. The wind still howled. But somewhere between the trees, he knew a small gray friend was out there, and that was enough. That evening, as the sun fell behind the western ridge, he stood on the porch, smoking his old pipe. The smoke curled through the cold air, fading into the orange light. A gust of wind swept through, carrying the faintest echo, the sound of leaves shifting, maybe footsteps, maybe something else. He took a slow breath, and the corners of his mouth lifted again. After all these years, John Harland had forgotten how to smile. Now, he remembered. Part 2. The Uninvited Storm. The wind had been restless for days, and by the third night, the storm finally broke. It came without warning, a low growl in the distance, then a sharp crack that shook the window panes of John Harland's cabin. Rain fell in thick, slanting sheets, rattling the tin roof like 1,000 thrown stones. John sat near the fire, boots off, hands around a mug of coffee gone cold. He stared at the window, half expecting to see the small gray figure dart past the porch. But the clearing was empty. Ash hadn't come for 3 nights. The food John left on the stone was untouched, washed clean now by the rain. The woods beyond the pasture were black, breathing in the thunder. Something's wrong, he thought. He couldn't explain it. But the silence between the thunderclaps felt heavy. Waiting. He stood, grabbed his lantern and coat, and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him hard, soaking his hat and shoulders in seconds. The smell of wet pine and earth filled his lungs. Scout, his old dog, barked once from inside, but John shut the door before he could follow. The world outside was chaos. Rain blurred the line between earth and sky. Trees bent under the weight of the wind, and the creek that cut through his land roared with muddy water. He moved quickly, the lantern bobbing in his hand, throwing golden arcs through the dark. Every few steps he stopped, listening, calling low. "Ash, you out here, boy?" Only thunder answered. He pushed deeper into the woods, boots sinking into mud, coat heavy with water. Branches scraped his face. The light flickered, hissed against the rain. Then, through the noise, he heard it, a weak, whimpering cry. Barely audible over the storm, but close. John froze. Lantern raised. "Ash," the sound came again, from the hollow of a fallen cedar up ahead. He ran toward it, heart pounding, breath steaming in the cold air. Inside the hollow, beneath a tangle of roots, lay the small creature. Ash was curled tight, his gray fur matted and soaked, one leg twisted under him. Mud streaked his face. He tried to move when John knelt beside him, but only let out a low, pained groan. "Easy. Easy now," John whispered. Voice rough but gentle. Ash's wide black eyes opened for just a moment. They caught the beam of the lantern reflecting. Not fear this time, but exhaustion. And then they closed again. That was all John needed to see. He set the lantern down, slid his arms under the creature's small frame, and lifted him. Ash was heavier than he looked, but limp as a child in sleep. John wrapped his coat tight around the shivering body, cradling him against his chest. The rain stung his face as he turned back toward the cabin. Lightning flashed white through the trees, and for a second, he thought he saw movement far off, a larger shape, watching. But when the thunder rolled, it was gone. The walk back felt endless. The mud clung to his boots, branches tore at his coat. But through it all, he held Ash close, whispering under his breath, as if the sound might keep them both warm. "Hang on, little fella. Just a bit further." When he reached the porch, the lantern sputtered out. He kicked the door open with his boot and stumbled inside, soaked to the bone. The warmth hit like a wave. He laid Ash near the hearth, pulling a blanket from the chair and wrapping it around him. The creature's breathing was shallow, uneven, but still there. John knelt, hands trembling slightly as he stoked the fire higher. The flames rose, painting the cabin in gold and shadow. He brushed wet hair from Ash's face and saw the small cut along his leg, deep but clean. He tore a strip from an old flannel shirt, dipped it in warm water, and began to clean the wound. Ash stirred, groaning softly. His hand, larger than a child's but human-shaped, twitched, then found John's arm. He didn't pull away. Outside, thunder rolled again, but softer now. The worst of the storm was passing. Inside, the only sounds were the crack of the fire and the slow rhythm of two hearts, one old and weathered, one fragile and new. John sat back on his heels, watching the flames dance in Ash's dark eyes. He thought of the first time he'd held his son like this years ago, during another winter, another storm. How small he had been, how fragile. The memory hurt, but it also warmed something inside him that had long been cold. Hours passed. The rain eased to a whisper, tapping gently on the roof. The fire settled into a soft, steady glow. Ash slept, his breathing slow, and even now, John leaned back in his chair, exhausted, watching the shadows flicker across the walls. For the first time, the cabin didn't feel like a tomb of silence. It felt alive, as if something sacred had been carried in from the storm. When John finally closed his eyes, he could still hear the faintest sound of the rain outside, and beneath it, the softest breath beside the fire, the sound of two worlds meeting in the warmth of one small, fragile night. By dawn, the storm had moved on, but inside that cabin, something else had taken its place, a fragile peace, and a promise neither of them could yet name. Part 3: The Fire in the Night. The storm had passed, leaving behind a deep, echoing quiet. Outside, the wind had gone still. Snow began to fall, not hard, but slow and steady, like ash drifting from a dying fire. Inside the small cabin, only the soft crackle of burning pine broke the silence. The air smelled of smoke, leather, and damp wool. John Harland knelt beside the hearth, sleeves rolled up, his hands steady though his breath came slow. Ash lay on a blanket near the fire, wrapped tight, his small frame trembling under the weight of exhaustion. The wound on his leg had stopped bleeding, but the fur around it was clotted with mud and rainwater. John dipped a cloth into the basin and began to clean the wound again. The creature stirred, a low groan, barely human, escaped its throat. Easy now. John muttered softly, voice rough but kind. Ain't gonna hurt you no more. Ash's eyes opened just a little deep, dark pools reflecting the firelight. For a heartbeat, they met John's. In that reflection, John saw more than fear. He saw confusion, pain, and something that looked a lot like trust. He wrapped the wound tight with a strip of clean flannel, then eased the creature closer to the fire. Ash's breathing slowed. The rise and fall of his chest matched the rhythm of the flames. John sat back, tired. The cabin was warm now, But the warmth reached deeper than the room it seeped into him, into the cold corners of his heart he hadn't felt in years. He reached for the old harmonica on the mantel. It was dented and dull from age, but still held the ghost of old songs. He wiped the dust from it with his thumb, took a slow breath, and began to play. The first note came rough, uncertain, cracking like an old man's sigh, but the next note steadied, carrying through the quiet room like a prayer. A slow, sad melody filled the air, a song from another time, a tune his wife used to hum when their boy was still alive. The fire flickered in rhythm, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Ash stirred again, his eyes half open now, watching. The harmonica's sound was new to him, strange, yet gentle. He tilted his head, almost listening, as if the song carried words he could somehow understand. John played on. Each note seemed to loosen something heavy in his chest. Each breath felt like letting go of years of silence. When the song ended, he lowered the harmonica and looked toward the small figure by the fire. Ash's gaze hadn't left him. There was a softness there, the kind of quiet that only comes when two souls recognize something familiar in each other's pain. "You'll be all right, little one," John whispered. "You just rest now." Ash blinked slowly, his expression unreadable but calm. The snow outside thickened, covering the world in white. The sound of the storm had faded completely, replaced by the steady rhythm of the fire. John leaned back in his chair, letting the warmth seep into his bones. He hadn't felt this kind of peace since before the accident, since the day the woods had taken his boy from him. He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as though life had given him another chance to keep something safe. He opened them again to find Ash watching him, truly watching now. Eyes bright, alert. The creature sat up a little, wincing, but steady. John smiled faintly. "Stubborn little thing," he murmured. Ash tilted his head, almost as if he recognized the tone, even if not the words. Then it happened quiet, simple, but enough to still the breath in John's chest. Ash lifted one small hand from under the blanket, his long fingers reaching toward John. For a moment, John just stared, unsure if he was dreaming. The hand hovered in the air between them, trembling slightly. Then, slowly, John extended his own. Their hands met rough, calloused human skin against coarse gray fur. The touch was light, hesitant, then firm. No words, no sound. Only the fire crackling and the faint hum of the wind outside. In that touch, something ancient passed between them, something that needed no language. Grief recognized grief. Loneliness met loneliness. And in that fragile space, both began to heal. Ash leaned back down, eyes closing again, still clutching John's hand for a moment before letting go. The fire burned low, the light dimming into a soft, golden haze. John stayed there beside him, hand resting on the blanket, listening to the even rhythm of Ash's breathing. Outside, snow covered the ground, hiding the mud, the tracks, the scars of the storm. Inside, two souls, one man. One creature shared the same warmth, the same silence, the same fragile peace. And as the night deepened, John realized the truth he hadn't dared to say aloud. He wasn't alone anymore. The wind sighed once through the chimney, and the flames leaned higher, bright and alive, the only fire still burning in the cold. Part 4. The Call of the Forest. The snow had stopped falling. A pale moon rose over the ridge, washing the forest in silver light. The night was quieter than it had been in weeks, too quiet, almost listening to itself. Somewhere beyond the trees, an owl called once and was answered by the low echo of the wind. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to coals. John Harland sat in his chair, half asleep, the harmonica resting on his knee. The warmth of the room wrapped around him like an old blanket, heavy but comforting. Then, he heard it faint at first, like a memory, a long, low sound, deep and resonant, carrying through the forest. It wasn't thunder, it wasn't wind, it was something older, a voice. John lifted his head, listening. The sound came again, a haunting call, mournful and distant, fading and returning like waves on a black shore. Ash stirred on the floor near the hearth. He sat up slowly, fur glinting in the dim light. His ears twitched. Then, without hesitation, he stood and moved toward the door. John rose after him, heart tightening. Ash. The creature didn't turn. He opened the cabin door with quiet strength, letting the cold spill in. The night air shimmered, and the moonlight traced the line of his shoulders. Ash stepped onto the porch and stopped. He lifted his head, listening again, still, silent, intent. The call came a third time. This one was closer. It rolled through the trees like a deep horn, filled with longing and loss. And this time, John understood. Someone was calling him. John reached for the lantern hanging by the door. The flame flickered to life, throwing soft light across his weathered face. He stepped out onto the porch beside Ash, boots creaking in the snow. The creature turned his head slightly, meeting John's gaze. For the first time, there was no fear in those dark eyes, only calm, and something else, a quiet understanding that words could never touch. John felt it deep in his bones, the truth he'd known since the storm. This little one didn't belong here. He belonged out there, where the moonlight touched the treetops and the earth hummed with ancient life. He set the lantern on the railing and whispered, "Go on, son. It's time." From the edge of the woods, a shadow moved, vast, graceful, and silent. Luna, the mother. She stepped from behind the trees, the moonlight rippling across her fur like water. Her eyes glowed softly, reflecting the same intelligence John had seen in Ash, only deeper, older. For a long moment, she didn't move closer. She just stood there, watching. Ash turned fully now, looking back at John. His face, if it could be called that, was solemn, but his gaze was clear. He took one hesitant step toward the trees, then another. Halfway across the clearing, he stopped, glancing back one last time. Their eyes met. In that single look was every word neither could say: thank you, farewell, and something like love. John swallowed hard, jaw tight. The lantern's flame wavered in the wind. He wanted to speak, to tell the little creature to stay, or to come back someday, but no words came. Luna lifted her massive head. Her gaze found John's through the silver air, and she gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't fearsome. It wasn't a warning. It was gratitude, pure and silent. Then she turned, stepping back into the trees, her shadow melting into the darkness. Ash followed, small beside her but sure-footed now, his limp gone, Within moments, both had vanished into the forest. John stood on the porch, the cold biting through his coat, the wind whispering through the pines. He didn't move for a long time. Then, almost without thinking, he picked up his harmonica. The metal was cold against his lips. He began to play the same slow tune he'd played by the fire that night. The notes rose softly, trembling through the quiet woods, carried by the wind. For a heartbeat, he thought he heard another sound answer distant, echoing his song, fading between the trees. He smiled through the ache in his chest. The harmonica's song was no longer sad. It had changed softer, brighter, like a prayer finally set free. The moon climbed higher. The clearing glowed silver, the snow glittering like glass. John lowered the harmonica and looked once more toward the forest. He couldn't see them, but he knew they were there. He turned back toward the cabin, leaving the lantern burning on the porch a light for those who might still wander. Behind him, the wind carried a single whisper through the pines. A farewell. A thank you. And as the door closed, the harmonica's echo lingered in the air, the sound of two worlds touching for the last time, bound not by fear, but by grace. Part 5. The Gift After the Wind. Morning came slow. The storm had long passed, and the forest outside the cabin seemed to be holding its breath. Mist clung to the treetops, rolling down the valley like smoke. The light of dawn was pale and weak, that kind of soft gold that never truly burns away the cold, but warms the heart just enough to keep it beating. John Harland woke to silence. No footsteps outside, no movement by the hearth. The blanket near the fire was empty. He sat up, blinking through the haze of sleep, half expecting to see a pair of dark eyes watching him from the corner, the way Ash had every morning since the storm. But the cabin was still. The air felt heavier without the creature's quiet breathing. For a long while, John just sat there, staring at the empty space. He'd known this would come. He'd known since the call last night, since Luna's shadow moved through the trees and Ash turned to go. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. He rose, joints stiff, and went to the door. The metal latch was cold under his palm. When he opened it, a breath of morning air swept through the cabin, clean, crisp, and full of the smell of pine. Mist curled over the porch steps, soft as smoke, and there, right where the boy the creature had stood, was something small. A stone. It was smooth, round, and pale gray, catching the early light like it had been polished by years of running water. But at its center, carved with surprising care, was a tiny handprint. John froze. He reached down and picked it up. It was cold at first, then warmed in his palm as if it remembered him. He sat down on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, the stone cradled in both hands. He turned it over slowly, tracing the carved lines with his thumb. The print was too small to belong to Luna, too delicate, too human-like. It could only be Ash's. The forest stretched out before him, miles of pine and frost, fading into the mist. He imagined them moving through it now, the small gray figure at his mother's side. Free again. Safe. The image brought a quiet ache to his chest. Sorrow and peace tangled together. He took a deep breath, the cold air sharp and real in his lungs. The wind rustled through the pines, and for just a second, he thought he heard footsteps again, soft, light and familiar. But when he looked, there was only fog shifting through the trees. He smiled faintly. Goodbye, little one. The sun climbed a little higher, weak rays slipping through the branches. They caught the edge of the stone, lighting it up in his hand. The carved handprint glowed faintly in the golden light, as if saying one last thank you. John set the stone on the railing beside him and leaned back, watching the world wake up. Birds began to stir, their songs quiet but alive. The forest, for all its vastness, didn't feel so lonely anymore. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his harmonica. The metal was still cold, but when he raised it to his lips, the sound came soft and clear, a simple tune, slow, gentle, like breath after tears. The melody floated out over the clearing, through the mist, across the pines. The world listened. He thought about everything that had happened, the footprints, the hunger, the storm, the fire, the farewell. And as he played, he realized something the wild had never been cruel. It hadn't taken his son, or given him pain, to punish him. It had only mirrored him, his fear, his loneliness, his grief. Ash wasn't a monster. He was a reflection of something John had forgotten. He still had the ability to care, to forgive, to protect. Maybe that's all the wild ever tries to do, to remind us of what we've lost and what's still worth saving. He lowered the harmonica, the last note trembling in the air. The forest seemed to hum back in answer, a soft breeze moving through the trees, carrying the faint scent of rain and cedar. John looked down at the stone once more, the tiny handprint catching the sunlight. He smiled, his eyes wet but bright. Then, in the quiet, a thought rose, not loud, not sad, but true. Sometimes, the wild doesn't try to hurt us. It just mirrors the parts of us we tried to forget. He placed the stone beside the porch lantern, a small beacon of memory. The light caught the carving one last time before the sun slipped higher, turning the mist to gold. John leaned back in his chair, letting the warmth touch his face. Somewhere deep in the forest, a faint, distant call echoed, not haunting this time, but free. He closed his eyes and smiled. The wild had given him something precious, and in return, he'd given it a little kindness. For the first time in years, the man and the forest were at peace. Evening settled gently over the ranch. The last light of day spilled across the wooden porch, painting everything in gold and dust. John Harland sat with his back against the post, harmonica in hand, the familiar tune floating soft and low into the cooling air. The fields shimmered beneath the dying sun. A flock of birds crossed overhead, their wings catching the orange light as they disappeared beyond the pines. The forest beyond was quiet, not empty, just resting. John's gaze lingered on the tree line. Somewhere out there, he knew, a small gray shape was moving through the shadows, alive and free. He smiled, not in sadness, but in peace. The melody slowed, faded, and finally fell silent. He exhaled, setting the harmonica on the step beside the carved stone. If you believe kindness can tame even the wildest things, leave it in the comments. And before you go to sleep tonight, remember sometimes kindness is the only fire still burning in the cold. The wind swept softly across the prairie. The light dimmed, and the old rancher kept smiling as the west whispered its quiet call good night.